It's time to take command with former NFL tight end Logan Paulsen and former Commanders beat reporter Craig Hoffman.
What's up? What's happening? Welcome in. It's the Take Command podcast. Craig Hoffman here, Logan Paulsen there. For those that are watching on YouTube, we have different heres and theirs this week, Logan. You're at your in-laws. I'm in a random hotel in Indianapolis, Indiana.
Yeah, what are you doing? You're on a little road trip or what?
Yeah, not road trip. We definitely flew. Took the nice little hour flight that we're all too familiar with from the NFL Combine that we do every year. But no, I'm here in Indy because my in-laws live in Ohio, and they're going to come up and meet us here because the Las Vegas Aces are in town to play the Indiana Fever twice in 3 days. So we were at the game last night, and our great friend Alicia Clark plays for the Aces. So we got a chance to go to the game, see her and the Aces take on Caitlin Clark and the Fever. Doing that again on Friday, and we get to see my niece and my brother and sister-in-law, my mother-in-law. They're all coming here to Indy from Ohio. So nice little chance to see some hoops, get the family together, and have a weekend where I do a week where I do a radio show and all my podcasts from a hotel room in Indy instead of my studio at home, because that's a thing that I clearly want to do. No,
yeah, it sounds like a good time though.
Yeah, you're just dealing with construction in your house.
Yeah, just construction. Just the normal stuff. So we're just navigating that. It's trying to stay out of people's way.
Yeah, so. And while we enjoy the occasional gnat sound of a dog bark or something in the podcast, the banging of construction not as conducive to quality listening.
Correct.
Yeah.
That's exactly right.
Yeah. Speaking of construction, Northwest Field, some new signage, that's for sure. But it is the home opener this weekend. We will dive into it all. We'll get to the X's and O's in just a few minutes. How can the Commanders defense bounce back against a Giants offense that I do think is potent, Logan, after watching a little bit of the tape. The execution, well, that was lacking. But we'll get into all of that. And then, of course, how can Jaden Daniels and company deal with Dexter Lawrence and a talented front on that Giants defense? But it is the home opener, and I do wonder what the atmosphere in the stadium is going to be. My guess, Logan, is it's going to be pretty exciting. I do think that there's probably a little bit of edge off after just how bad they lost in Tampa and specifically giving up that 37 defensively. But it's the first game of the Jaden Daniels era, and I would expect in year 2 of the Josh Harris era, but really kind of almost last year 0, I would expect the fans to I would expect this to be one of the most partisan burgundy and gold crowds that we've seen at Northwest / FedEx in a long time. And I'm pretty excited to see the atmosphere and also, what they did to the stadium, which I know you got a preview of for the preseason game when you were there.
Yeah, no, I think it's going to be a really exciting opportunity. I think, you're probably right. It's probably not quite as exciting as if they had beaten Tampa Bay, but I don't know, man. I hope fans come out. I hope they're really supportive of the team because I think this is a great opportunity. We're going to talk about this in the preview, for them to get kind of back on track. And, you mentioned the offense. There's some stuff defensively I think they can take advantage of. But, I think fans should come out and check out the new stadium. I don't really walk the stadium as much, but I did a fantasy football fan event there. They've redone all the suites. They have a little section right before you walk into the stadium now that used to be kind of just storage, and now it's a little nightclub area. And they've redone all the signage. They've definitely invested some money in there, and it looks, I think, significantly better. And I think the fan experience is significantly better. I was talking to Fred about how the food prices had gone down. I don't buy food there on game day because I'm doing other stuff, but Fred seemed pretty adamant that it was cheaper and everything was better. So I would trust Fred because he's the mayor of, now what is it? Northwest Field. Yeah. Have you ever been to a game with Fred? He just walks, every single person knows Fred. He's kissing babies. He's giving hugs. So if anybody's talking about how nice the new stadium is, it's definitely Fred, and I would trust him on that. So I think definitely come out, support the team. I think people forget. Again, we talked about this on the last show. It is a rebuild, but I think there's things to be excited about. There's young players to watch. There's new offense, new defense, and you're going to see this team grow a lot over these next 4 weeks probably. So I think to see that, to see the stages of it, and hopefully they win a couple games on the way, I think it's going to be very exciting.
Yeah, for sure. I think, on the infrastructure front, if you will, they said they've worked on the ingress, egress, getting in and out of the stadium. So hopefully it's a lot easier just to get to the game and then get home afterwards. And I'm kind of curious to see how that goes. We don't really experience that necessarily either because we get there so early and wind up leaving so much later. By the way, our post-game stream will be whenever we are ready to do it on Sunday after our other post-game responsibilities. So Logan and I, unless Logan's Lance going to shake his head no and say, no, we're not doing that. What are you talking about? We're going to be live at the stadium like we did last year. So
that sounds good to me.
Because then we're done, and then we get to go home, Logan, and we get to see our families, and they can be like, hey, okay, your football day is over. So we're going to do that on Sunday, which obviously gets us out of the stadium a lot later than most of the fans, but like, used to be sometimes we'd do that post-game stream and there'd still be traffic getting out of the lots, and hopefully that is long gone. People can get out, or if there are people in the lots, it's because they're hanging out afterwards celebrating a Commanders win. And so I'm definitely curious to see, because they put, I want to say it was like $70 million into the stadium. I know there was like one $40 million investment when they first got there, and then I think they put another like $30 million or so in it throughout the last year and through this offseason. So I'm excited to see how that entire fan experience has changed, and definitely excited to see the electricity of the fan base with Jaden Daniels. And I think getting out to a hot start would be great, because at the end of the day, like if you get out to a bad start and there's just kind of this sense of dread. I guess what I'm trying to say, Logan, is last week felt really familiar in a lot of ways. I think we have faith that it's not going to be the same old whatever version of this team has been in the long term, that the people here now are more equipped to fix some of the issues that happened on the field. But from a fan standpoint, like especially in the emotions of the moment, you just don't want it to feel the same. You don't want to feel like, oh, more coverage bust. Oh, we can't do this. Oh, our young quarterback is running for his life. Like, you just don't want to feel that. So I'm really hoping they can come out and get off to a good, crisp start, because I think that will affect the atmosphere in the stadium. And far better than me as a guy who played 10 years, what that home crowd advantage can do.
Yeah, I'm 100%. I mean, I think I hope for the same thing is basically what I'm going to say. I think, and there's a lot of reason to think, like when you watch the film, someone asked me this, I think it was Kevin Sheehan, I did his podcast this week, and he was just saying, like it kind of feels very similar to last year. And I kind of, to my eye, it was like, no, when you watch the film, it's different. And there's like a precipice here. There's like, a couple of mental mistakes here, a couple finishes there. And we're talking about a very different defense specifically. And offensively, there's a couple throws here, a couple blocks here, and all of a sudden it's very different. And I know we've been saying stuff like that about this team for a long time, but there's a urgency, a speed, a competitiveness on the field, an energy, let's say, that hasn't been there. And so when I see that, I'm very encouraged. I'm kind of like, okay, like we're not there yet, but it's right around the corner. It's like kind of they're laying the right foundation. So when it all kind of clicks and comes together, I think they're going to be in a really good spot. So I think, if you're a fan, I think I understand why there's some pessimism, and I understand why there's this kind of doom and gloom and this cascade of like negative emotions. But remember, everything is different. Like I was doing an interview with Dan the other day, and I said, oh, like Daniel Jones, man, he really has been getting after this team for a long time. And he's like, I can't speak on the past. Like what I'm going to speak on is what's happening now. And I think like that's a good mindset for me to have too. Like it's for fans and us and the coaches and the players, like this is not the same. As much as it feels the same, it's not the same. And the energy is different, the vibe's different, the investment in the team is different. And so just remind yourself of that. This is not Ron Rivera. This is not Jay Gruden. This is not Mike Shanahan. This is a totally different thing from the top down. And as a result, I think the product on the field will be different at some point this year. We've talked a little bit about how there's some limitations in terms of roster talent. But I think this team's going to feel a lot like Arizona last year. They're in games they shouldn't be in because they play hard and they're well coached. And I think that's ultimately what we're going to settle on. I hope we get that game, a version of that game this weekend versus the Giants.
Yeah, and they are talented enough to compete with the Giants, so hopefully they can pull out the win. I do think that there's going to be like the Benjamin St. Juste plays are the plays that I'm worried are going to be kind of the plays that we see all year, not specific to BSJ, but those are some of those talent plays, right? Like, oh, you just can't make the play. At the end of the day, like, can you finish? And it's like sometimes you just need playmakers, and this team doesn't have the playmakers. And so sometimes you're going to have guys that try really hard and get beat, and that's what happens during a rebuild. And honestly, like, I'm not going to tell fans how to feel, but like I personally will live with that because I'm just like, okay, I see that they are being well coached, that they're trying their best, and they might not just have the juice to finish out a play. But when there's the mental mistakes and stuff like that, those need to get corrected. And obviously, I think that was something that really stuck in Dan's craw and Joe Witt Jr.'s craw this week of like, man, like we gotta clean that stuff up. That's the stuff that we can't live with. But they knew that immediately after the game, and there's no excuses being made. It's like we got to be better. And to the Daniel Jones point, Logan, he has been an absolute Commander killer, but Dan Quinn's experience with Daniel Jones,
not the same.
Do you know the combined score of the two Cowboys-Giants games last year?
All I remember is watching the first, because it was that was the year after the Giants got to the playoffs, right? And I remember watching that first game, being like, all right, this should be a competitive football game. Maybe two people. I think it was like, what was it, 40-7 or something crazy? Like it was an outlandish.
It was 40-0.
Yeah, it was an outlandish score, and he threw a bunch of pick sixes, had a fumble, like. Dan got after him. That defense got after him. So, And
the second game wasn't any better. The second game was 49-17. So the combined score was 89-17. Cowboys 89, Giants 17 last year. You think Dan Quinn's scared of Daniel Jones? Now, unless there's something where Daniel Jones turns into a different person when he sees burgundy. I was joking earlier. I don't know whether it was on our show or whether it was on the radio show. I was like, do you wear the black jerseys this week just so he doesn't see any burgundy?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. Like that, whatever he does, he figures it out versus us. Brian Daboll is a great offensive play caller. He does a good job creating unscouted looks. He's going to look at probably what Tampa Bay did and say, how can we incorporate that? But yeah, I feel very confident that Dan's going to figure it. And I think the other thing that's really refreshing is like in the post-game presser, we're not talking about the refs. We're not talking about the weather. We're talking about things that this team can do to get better. And I think identifying that immediately post-game was really cool too. So kudos to the staff for getting on that. And it gives me optimism, man, that like people are going to get better this year. People are going to get better. No one's going to stay the same, because if they do stay the same, they're not going to be here. They're not going to play. So like I'm really encouraged when I hear language like that in the post games and in the weekly pressers from the coordinator, from the head coach, because it's like that's good football. So like I don't know what's going to happen with the result of this game. Hopefully it's a win, obviously, but whatever it is, it's going to be better than it was last week, because like just I bumped into Dan, talked to him briefly, and just like the look in his eye is of a man who was like, that was not acceptable, and I know it's not acceptable, and I'm going to do everything I can to make sure that it won't happen again. And they'll make new mistakes, right? They'll have new issues, but I think ultimately they, like that's something that it's just different, and I'm excited about.
I think, one way you could phrase it is, in the past you had coaches that would get to a point in a season where they looked for excuses, and this is a coach that's looking inward going, how can I get better? No excuses. Right. Like what I don't care about whatever circumstances may have inflicted upon me. I want to figure out what I can do. And he talked about that specifically on the defense, which we're going to flip to here in a second. But like, he's like, the first thing we do is we don't even look at the players. We look at the calls. Like, did we do a good enough job as a staff? And then we get to the players and like what they could have done to execute better. So it is a full comprehensive look. Cool. And of course, like, I don't think that Ron Rivera didn't do that, but does he do it with the intensity and intentionality? Like, it's one thing. It's like when someone gets in trouble and they hire a law firm, and it's like, our law firm investigated. It's like, we know what you're being paid to find, which is nothing. Good investigation. Okay, you're doing a PR bit. I think they're really like, hey, what can we find? Because we know if we don't fix it, we're gonna be having the same exact results in the future. So let's actually start, Logan, with the Commanders' defense. Let's start off, because we were just talking about Daniel Jones and Brian Daboll and what they have posed to this team in the past, why they've struggled with Dan's defense in the past. Watching them on tape against Minnesota, like, you see some of the explosive qualities. You see Daboll and Kafka, I think, and some of the really good designs. And then you see a quarterback in Daniel Jones who can't put the ball where he needs to on a lot of occasions. What do you like? Why are you so confident in Dan's ability to get this right, and Joe's ability to get this right against Daboll, Kafka, and this Giants offense?
Well, I do think that there are some, there are some limitations to the offense, the Giants offense. And the limitation, I think, starts with the quarterback. You know what I mean? I think, like, when you look at him, he's a guy that is struggling at times to see the field. And sometimes I think he's like hunting for big plays. He's just not playing the best version of Daniel Jones football. I'm not saying he's a top 10 quarterback, but, he's definitely not playing in that top 20 range where he gets to every once in a while and looks like a ball player. So I think that's the major limitation for me. Like there's times obviously like where, I think Minnesota did a great job of defending concept and like getting under stuff and making him hold the football and giving them different looks, and all that stuff's great. But ultimately I think like when you look at the version of the offense that he had when he was in Buffalo with, what's his name? Josh Allen. Like they were able to do more stuff. And I think like that's ultimately what you come back to is like the scheme can be as good as you want it to be, but if you're lacking in execution, it's never going to take off the way you want it to take off. So I think that's to me the main issue, because I think we've seen Kafka do some really good stuff. We've seen Dayball, be like very, very smart football minds, but right now the execution is just not where it needs to be. And I think right now they're looking, it felt like when I watched the film, and again, it's week 1, so, like keep that in mind when we're talking about this. It felt like they were still looking for an offensive identity, so to speak. They were looking for something that they could hang their hat on. Like certain teams, like you watch them, it's like, this is who we are. Like Minnesota is a great example. It's like, we're going to find a way to get the ball to JJ and make sure that that he's maximized in this offense, right? And we've got enough other playmakers to kind of distribute the football effectively, but how do we maximize his opportunities and his touches? And I feel like there wasn't that in this game, right? They're like, oh, let's run a quarterback run, and like this is what we're going to hang our hat on, and those weren't overly effective, and let's get Malik Neighbors involved, but you couldn't get open down the field partially because there was protection issues. Like they just didn't have that thing yet. Like when you watch Cliff's offense, even there's a very clear offensive perspective. Like this is who we want to be. And again, I think that's going to change and grow as we go through the season. But I feel like in watching the Giants versus Minnesota, they just had nothing that was like, this is who we are. And I'm not saying they can't find that versus the Commanders in week 2, but in the first opening game, it was like last year, for example, when you watch the Giants, it was like, we're going to boot out of the pocket. We're going to find ways to get Daniel Jones on the move. We're going to change the launch angle. We're going to do all this stuff. There wasn't even that, you know what I mean? There wasn't even that kind of underlying thought in the offense. And a little bit of that is just they couldn't get on rhythm and they couldn't execute enough to kind of, I think, flesh out an offensive identity.
Yeah, it seems like they wanted to attack some of those intermediate areas of the field too, and like let's have Malik Neighbors run out and hook up at 20 yards and see if we can get big chunk plays that way. Last year they had good success deep against the Commanders and in some other games because Tyrod, he's a willing deep thrower. And once he was in there, that was a big part of what they did. And it's like Tyrod's if he gets the matchup, he's gonna throw it. And you see some like really good route concepts, and you can kind of watch guys be like, oh, that guy's about to pop open. Yep, and there it is. But sometimes you're like, oh, this is working. Why isn't the ball out yet? And an extra half beat from Daniel Jones means that an underneath defender can come and get a hand on it. There's a ton of tip balls. There's also him throwing on the wrong shoulder, and you wonder, is that him being totally inaccurate, or is that he's a tick late and thus the receivers kept moving? Is the receiver not running the route with the precision it needs to? But whatever it is, like it's resulting in incompletions, and it's at times good concept being wasted, but it does feel very patched together in a way that when you flip the tape and you're like, all right, let me watch the Giants defense against this Minnesota offense, there is a flow to Kevin O'Connell's play calling and intentionality with it that just, I don't like. At the end of the day, you're just watching play after play after play when you're watching tape, but there is still just a feel to it that it just feels cohesive. You're like, oh, the ball is here. Now it's here. There's some deep, there's some shallow, there's some left, there's some right. And there is just a great variety to it that makes you, if you're defensively, you're on your toes because every blade of grass is available. And, for the Giants, there just isn't that cohesion offensively. And it does feel, like I said, patched together in a way where it's like, we know we're supposed to get Malik Neighbors the ball. Okay, let's get him a touch. And by the way, that's better than not getting Malik Neighbors the ball.
Right.
So they do a good job at times of scheming stuff up where he's the primary, or even they got him a couple of screens in this game to be like, we got to make sure that our horse gets the ball, but it is not necessarily within the flow of an offense. It's like if you were just in basketball, I'd be like, all right, hey, we run this motion offense, but every once in a while we got to get our big guy a post up. And it's like, all right, how do we make that happen within our identity? And it didn't seem like week 1 against a Minnesota defense that's not exactly a world beater group that they had that.
No, I think that's right. And I think, having again, called games at a very different level, I felt like when I watched the game, they just couldn't get in an offensive rhythm. And so, like you mentioned, like the fluidity of Minnesota, and like sometimes when you as a play caller, when you can, again, this is just from personal experience, when you can stack plays, it gets you in that zone. And I felt like the Giants just couldn't stack, man. Like, you're in 3rd and 7 way more than you want to be. You're in these remember, like as you get in longer down in distance on 3rd down, the playbook just gets smaller and smaller and smaller. So you might have like a brilliant, 3rd and 2 call that you never get to because you can't manage the game effectively to get to those things. It's a little bit kind of what happened with Cliff week 1, right? Like we couldn't get into the flow of the offense really outside of a couple of drives because we couldn't manage 1st and 2nd down effectively. And again, like why is that? I think the why is kind of what you're alluding to there. Like Daniel Jones is a little bit off, like the depth of the receivers a little bit. It just didn't feel sharp. And I think that lack of sharpness, like it's like which came first, the lack of sharpness or the lack of offensive cohesion, like the lack of offensive consistency and fluidity. Like are they like which is one causing the other? And probably so, but they definitely have a causation amongst each other, right? So like when we can't execute our offense, we're going to look like poop a little bit, you know what I'm saying? And like when we look like poop, we can't stay on rhythm with our stuff. So I think that's kind of what I'm looking at with the off. And again, it's week 1. It might have been a bad outing. Like they might have been dicing up in training camp and looking like a bunch of ballers. Like I have no idea, but that's not what it looked like on film. And again, I'm a really staunch believer that week 1 is the biggest overreaction maybe in all of sports. Like, because you're going to get teams that look bad that figure it out and teams that look great that fall apart. And so, again, like I said, maybe the Giants have all this stuff figured out, just off week for Daniel Jones, and it really showed up. I don't know. But that's something that, again, like when fans are like, we're going to kill the Giants or whatever we're going to do, it's like that's an NFL football team. Brian Daboll is a smart guy. Mike Kafka is a smart guy. They're going to have some type, like they're going to have an unscouted look, a different offensive wrinkle this week. And we saw last week how our defense struggled with unscouted looks. And so can we adjust in game with a bunch of young guys to make that happen? So I just think there's layers to this thing. And it, explaining why an offense is bad is not always the easiest thing to do, but it didn't look right, I will say, in week 1 for the Giants.
How hard is that in-game adjustment for something that is completely unscouted? Like obviously practice is really important and you can slow things down and have teaching time. But, last week you have the trap wham stuff all of a sudden come up in the run game. You have some stuff you don't expect in the passing game. How hard is it not only to be like, hey, this is how we want to attack that, but implement it into the game plan, if you will, right? Because like if for the trap wham stuff, right, it's designed to take advantage of really aggressive vertical defensive tackles. And if your whole plan is to be that, and now all of a sudden you're telling your guys, hey, we need to watch out for that because they're trying to take advantage of it. It's one thing to be like technique wise, I need you to get your hands here. I need you to check this with your eyes. But it's kind of like when we talk about stopping the option, it's like, well, it's easy. You have this guy who's responsible for the quarterback and this guy's responsible for the running back. Well, that's fine if you know it's going to be the option. Right. But when you don't know, you have to recognize and then figure out what am I supposed to do again? So how hard is it? And I don't know if you have any really good examples of this. Obviously for you, it'd be on the offensive side from your career, but how hard is that to implement in game?
It can be really challenging. And I think it's harder for younger players. Like when you're playing against a bunch of veterans, like they just have an ability to handle. Like I got a simple example. So this was for me, this was in 2013, 2014, maybe it was Jay's first year here. And it was a short yardage situation and we were taking a play action shot. It was like 4th and 1. And so they came out in a bear front. And I know what a bear front is. I know if you saw Logan drop a bear front, I could do it in my sleep. It's basically like a jam front. So the center guard and tackle are all covered. They have ends like outside kind of 9 techniques, and they have a choke player over top of you, right? They have a guy like right over your nose, right? And usually that's a DB, it's a safety because he's man coverage on the tight end, right? And then they're playing man in the back, boom. But for whatever reason, they came out and the choke player was a defensive end. So there's 2 defensive ends to my side. There's a guy over my nose and there's a guy outside of me. And this is, I'm a relatively young player. It's my 4th or 5th year in the league. And I had never seen that before. And I remember thinking like, I know I have to block the rusher, but because they're both defensive ends, I don't know who it is. I don't know which one it is. So I'm going to protect my inside gap, which is this guy who's right over my head. So I took a step down, and he's actually got me a man-to-man coverage, and the other guy rushes off the edge for a sack. So again, that's an example. Like, I never made that mistake again in my career, but I needed to see it one time to make sure I got it right. You know what I'm saying? Like, that was an unscouted look for me. And I remember coming in the meeting room and the coach being like, you know, like, I could maybe coach this better, but you got to intuitively know that this is a bare front. And I was kind of like, in retrospect, looking back, I'm like, is that really fair? Because we never discussed this. I've never seen this, right? And again, like, that's kind of a tough look, because it's like, you know, you got your 8 boxes on the screen, you know, when you're doing your install, and there's one box for that specific thing. And, you know, the other ones are all related to stuff you see 40 times in a game, right? And so I missed it, but I never missed it again. And so I think that's the challenge of unscouted looks with inexperienced players. Because again, if I saw that in year 8 or 9, yeah, I know this is a bare front, I'm going to block out because that's the rusher, this is the man guy. But it took me making a mistake to make that correction. So I think with young players specifically, it can be really, really challenging because you've never seen it before. So you're kind of making these in-game assessments. Like another simple one is, like, we were running a power in 2012, and they lined up in a different front. And so I know I have to block the end by rule, but he's a 9 technique. So technically he was the Sam in this look. So I blocked out. And then even I went back to the huddle and I talked to the Trent, I talked to DY, and they were like, yeah, let's do it like this. And all 3 of us were able to get it corrected. So I blocked down, DY kicked out, and we gashed him the next play. Because we were in game, we knew each other well enough to get that corrected. So I think that's where, like, having experience and having a comfortability, if that's a word, to deal with your teammates and kind of get those things digested is so, so helpful. And it doesn't happen all the time. And I think that's why when you have a bunch of young players playing, it becomes harder because they don't have the experience to be like, oh, like, let's just do this. Like, this is what we got. I got to go to the sideline first. Coach has got to get it corrected. But that might be after a touchdown if we're not careful, if that makes sense.
Right, totally. And I was going to say, it's one thing when that stuff happens up front, right? Do John Allen and Daron Payne talk to each other and be like, hey, we can get this figured out.
Right.
And also Bobby Wagner prevented it from being a touchdown because he made it only, like, it was bad. It was a 10-yard game, but Wagner or, you know, whoever, Quan came down and made a tackle. When it's Sainristil Still and Quan and Jalen McMillan leaks up the sideline because they both go to the same dude into man-to-man coverage where 2 guys come together and their pick and roll coverage is bad, if you will.
Right.
You give up a touchdown. Now you're going back to the sideline being like, what are we doing there?
And your coach is going to have a really good answer. He's going to be like, this is what you're supposed to do. But in the moment, because we didn't think about it and I haven't seen it before, that's the result. And hopefully you have a bunch of kind of, deliberate, focused, professional guys, which I think we do, that are going to now, like, you better believe I'm going to ask those questions in the meeting this week. Hey, if we get a bunch and we get this concept, what are our rules? And again, that's why I think it's good. Like people are like, oh man, they lost, they gave up 37 points. It's good. You need to have those games because every mistake for the right player is a learning experience. And so if Brian Daboll comes out with the same looks or similar kind of approaches, getting into bunches, like the pre-snap, the like, I don't know, which I'm going to call it like a jet motion, like right as the ball is being snapped, you're moving to a 3-by-1. I've seen it now. And now I have stuff in my brain to be like, okay, we can get this corrected. I know what to do. I can check to this. I can talk to Quan. I can talk to Jeremy Chin, and we can get it worked out. So I think that's why I come out of the Tampa Bay game encouraged, because I find that when the first game is really tough against a good opponent, you kind of got to get in your bag a little bit as a team and be like, okay, shoot, well, like they kind of brought it to us. Like I wasn't prepping the way I needed to prep. The game plan wasn't where it needed to be if I'm a coach. And now we can really motivate and push to get that thing better. And I think you'll see that versus the Giants this week.
Certainly hoping so. I think there was an interesting quote from Dan this week. David Harrison related on our show yesterday or on Wednesday when he joined us, and he said Dan talked about how there's lessons in this game. That was something he said immediately in the post game, and when he was followed up on it on Wednesday in his press conference, it was like there's not a lesson for every player on every play. Like sometimes, because we were talking about Frankie Louvu, and like sometimes the play just goes away from you, and like there's nothing for Frankie Louvu to learn on a run play that goes away from him. Like he did his job. He's not involved in the play. Like he's there in case there's a cutback. Okay, cool. But there's other plays where there are lessons for Frankie Louvu, and he's involved in the action. Or, obviously plenty of other plays on a play where Frankie Louvu doesn't have a lesson. Mike Sainristil still does, or whatever. Right. And so, do you 100%. Take your lessons from your reps that you need, and how quickly can you apply them? Like that is what it means to be a professional in the NFL, and we'll see if they can do that this week.
And I'm so glad you brought that up, because it's also like if I'm a really good pro, I'm learning a lesson from Sainristil's lesson. You know, like when we talk about it in the meeting with the whole team, I'm like, oh yeah, that leverage is really important. If I'm in man coverage, I got to make sure I do that same thing. It's the same thing like with Kyle. He'd coach, we'd have like a meeting, sit down, go over the whole offense for a couple plays. And he'd be like, hey, what's the split here for the receiver? And it's like, oh, it's +2. It's like, oh shoot, well, I had that rep last week in practice and I wasn't +2, but I got to make sure I'm locked in on that. You know what I'm saying? It's good because you learn the defense more. You learn the soft spots of the defense or the offense, and it just makes you better. So I think, again, I think it doesn't feel good, but I think it is helpful for learning new stuff for sure.
All right, before we head over to the Commanders' offense, anything specifically we want to point out with the personnel on the Giants' offense? We haven't really talked about their O-line yet at all. What opportunities may exist there, let's say. But if you're scouting the Giants' offense beyond the stuff that we've talked about and some of their struggles, like how are you setting it up in the meeting this week if you're Joe Witt?
Yeah, so I think the thing is their O-line is significantly improved. You know, they invested a lot of money at guard. I think those guys still got to show me something. But Illuminor, the right tackle, is significantly better than Neal was. Like, he's a good football player. Obviously, Andrews on the other side. What's his
Andrew
first name?
Thomas, yeah.
Andrew Thomas, yeah. On the other side is, probably the best player on their offense. So their two tackles are pretty consistent. Like, good football players, physical in the run game. They understand the line and pass pro. So I know they gave up 5 sacks, but to me, 3 of those are on Daniel Jones just holding the ball too long, right? And I think offensively they have some really interesting skill pieces. I'll talk about tight end because I think their tight ends are interesting. They got Theo Johnson, the kid from Penn State, who's like 6'6", 270 and can run like a deer.
Athlete, yeah.
They got Manhurts now, and they got Bellinger. So they got 3 dudes.
Manhurts is still in the league?
Yeah. They got 3 dudes that are pretty gnarly, like from a physicality standpoint, and that shows up. Like, those guys are going to lean on you, push on you a little bit.
There is a play in the second quarter where it's like a max pro and Bellinger's in there and the line, or the Vikings D line pushes away from him. So he winds up with no one and he just looks inside and he realizes that he's got no one to his own responsibility, which means he can go help, and he murders the defensive end, just cleans his clock. I was like, that's a Logan Paulson block right there. That is the stuff that Logan's dreams were made of when he was a player. And then the right Illuminor just he's like, okay, I'll take the pancake, and just goes and lays on top of him because he literally knocked him over.
And so you got 3 dudes like that. So I think that'll be interesting from a physicality standpoint because Tampa Bay didn't really have that. They have a guy like that. You know what I mean? Like, they were physical in the O-line, but like to have 3 dudes that you can get in 13 personnel and I could see them maybe if they're not happy with Daniel Jones, like getting in 22 personnel and one of those guys plays fullback, getting in 13 where one's on the line, and like trying to be physical up front because like I think those guys are all pretty gosh darn good football players. Robinson,
and we know by the way that the Commanders want to be light personnel wise, like they want to live in nickel and dime, and so that is a fun personnel chess match to watch
for sure. And then you got Wan'Dale Robinson, who I think is athletically one of the most fun slots to watch. He's a little inconsistent catching the football, but he can create space. There was a couple times where I thought, man, he did a great job on a choice route underneath, like kind of option routes, and he's wide open, and Daniel Jones is getting a little bit of pressure, misses the throw, and you're like, man, that would have been an explosive play. So again, like that's one of those things where you're like, that guy could kill you if you're not careful here, right? If Mike Sanderson's not on his A game and doesn't understand how to handle the bunch here, like he's going to be wide open. He's got some juice. I mean, Malik Neighbors, I think, has the ability to be something special, but they just didn't seem to be quite on the same page, right? It's the protection, it's the looks, like the coverages that Minnesota was playing, like just kind of muddied up some of the play that I keep thinking of is they ran like what I would call a dragon concept, so a flat, a drag, and then a slant, and it's like supposed to be a super easy, like get your quarterback on pace first kind of throw, and they're Minnesota's playing this odd front and the outside linebackers are up. You think they're going to rush, and so the slant's going to be there, and then the dude just drops out first play of the game, like kind of totally unexpected. Danny Jones has to hold the football, it ends up being like a sack, or he has to go through his whole progression, gets to the back falls down, it's a -5. You know what I'm saying? Like that's kind of what their offense felt like. They just couldn't get it going. But I do think they have pieces, and I think they're much improved offensively from last year. I think, again, this is kind of lazy analysis, but I think this is what ultimately relies on. It's like, how efficient can Daniel Jones be, and how can they maximize him? They tried to run the ball a lot with him. I'm not sure that's where he's at his best. When you run it with him, 8 to 10 times, I think you want to get him on the move with keepers and stuff. So I'd expect that this week. But I do think they're not the Giants from last year offensively. Let's just say that. They present more challenges because they're a little bit faster. They're a little more physical. They're a little bit more buttoned up front.
Yeah, no, that offensive line, I mean, it couldn't have been worse than what it was last year. And this year, they definitely, you see some of the investment already starting to pay off. If you want to see really good personnel up front for the Giants, well, let me introduce you to Dexter Lawrence and his friends. The Giants defense is they've got some dudes on that side of the ball. Obviously, Kevin O'Connell and Justin Jefferson and crew did a great job last week to be able to handle it. They were able to neutralize what they needed to neutralize, get JJ the ball where they needed to. He got in the end zone. Everybody gritty. If you're ask you the same question, but now you're Cliff Kingsbury. What's the scouting report for this New York Giants team this week, and where does it start?
Yeah, for me, it starts with, obviously, Dexter Lawrence. We'll get to him in 1 second, but Shane Bowen is the new defensive coordinator there. So it feels so much different than it did last year. Last year, it's like the craziest, most unsound pressures, and you're just like, this guy, this can't be like a real thing we're seeing because they're just bringing everybody, and this guy's looping in the same gap, and just bombs over Baghdad. Comparatively, this is an extremely conservative defense. It feels very similar to like Bill Belichick from like 2005. You know what I mean? It's like we're going to play quarters, we're going to play a little cover 2, we're going to play 6, we're going to match. And then much like Belichick, they are a little bit of a game plan team. So they're going to kind of say like, what do you do well? How do we take it away? And I think that's going to be a really interesting chess match between Cliff. Like, what is he like if I'm Cliff, I'm thinking, what does he know about us based on week 1? How do I prevent him from taking that away? Like Jaden's scrambling ability, like, are they going to change their rush path? Are they going to blitz more? Are they going to use a spy? Like if I'm Shane Bowen after watching last week, I'm throwing in some of those pressures that they ran in Tampa Bay just to see if we got it locked up. You know what I mean? We had some free runners. We had some issues with some line stunts in terms of Wiley and Cosme on different levels. Like, let's throw that at them, see if they got it fixed. And so if I'm Cliff, I'm like, okay, how do we do that? What coverages gave us an issue? How do we beat man-to-man? Because we had a little bit of an issue. Jaden did in certain situations with that. So I would expect maybe a little bit more than last week, but I'd say at its core, the defense is a little bit simpler. Like they're going to have a wrinkle for you, but on the whole, it's a little bit simpler. So I think that's advantageous for Jaden Daniels. Now, you mentioned the front, and like, Dexter Lawrence, I know he doesn't get talked about in the same way as like Chris Jones and Micah Parsons, but he statistically is one of the most dominant defensive players in the NFL over the last 3 years. And like when you watch the game, you watch Minnesota's offense, like he's creating sacks, he's creating TFLs, like he just is able to do a lot. And when you look at his body type, it doesn't make a lot of sense because he's 6'5", he's 350. He doesn't move. He's not like lightning quick. He's just a bear. Like I've never seen a guy consistently overpower offensive linemen the way he does and just push the pocket and create pressures. So to me, he's the problem. And I know people talk about Burns on the edge and Kayvon Thibodeau, and I think they're very good athletes, but they haven't, to me, lived up to the name just yet. Like I know Kayvon Thibodeau had 10 sacks last year. I think 6 of them were against third-string offensive linemen, like just from different teams because of injury things over the course of the season. Against good players, he doesn't really show up. That's not to say he won't.
Yeah, he also, for whatever reason, had Charles Leno's number. Like that was just a great matchup for him.
Like he just had a good feel for it, for sure.
Yeah.
And then, obviously Burns, like, is this guy that has this great reputation because LA was going to trade 2 first-round picks for him a couple years ago. He's got athletic pass rush juice. It doesn't always kind of lead to production. And I was talking to someone about that. It's like, how do you kind of weigh and scout those guys? And they were like, well, because of Dexter Lawrence, it changes their dynamic because Dexter's going to push the pocket. The quarterback's going to want to step back, and you're going to get a lot more sacks of those guys running high on the edge, which I didn't even think about. Because of that one guy in the middle's ability to disrupt. So I think that's something that I'm definitely going to be watching because Jaden, the one fumble that he had, you can say the first one, where he lateral fumble, whatever.
Right.
The one that he had like at the 40-yard line, he gets a little bit of pressure internally. He steps back in the pocket and the ball gets out. And I think like you got to be hyper aware because it's going to like that's how their pressure is going to feel almost every time. Pressure up the middle because he's really good, Dexter, and those guys are just racing to that spot. So don't step back. And how do we handle that if as a young player, kind of dealing with different rush patterns?
Yeah, I mean, one thing that I kind of noticed the more I watched last week back too is, and this was kind of his rep coming in. Biotish is really, really solid, but he's not he's not the strongest guy in terms of moving people. And obviously trying to move Vita Vea is a task that nobody can accomplish. And Dexter Lawrence, that just sucks if you're Tyler Biotish. You sign with the Commanders, you're like, okay, cool. I'm excited. DQ was my guy in Dallas. All right, let's see what this schedule looks like. Cool. Weeks 1 and 2, I get Vita Vea and Dexter Lawrence.
Yeah.
What?
Two of the best pure noses in
right.
the NFL.
You don't see many nose tackles, period. And then you get those two jokers back to back weeks 1 and 2. So what can Cliff and Bobby Johnson do to help Biotish out, not only in the pass rush situations, but also if one of the solutions is going to be to run the football, to make sure they can get the movement that they need up front, because Vea was able to kind of stunt some of that stuff last week just because he's so freaking big and hard to move.
Well, we'll say the one thing that I thought Tyler Biotish had a pretty good game. I'm not saying, I agree that that's a tough matchup, but
it's not like he lost a ton. It's just he's going to move people in a way later this year when it's not Vita Vea, in a way that he was not able to move Vita Vea because Vita Vea is an actual mountain of a man.
Yeah, no, I agree with what you're saying. I think I just wanted to point out so fans aren't thinking that he's playing bad, but
right.
It's what I would say the thing about Tampa Bay that's tough is they're always moving around. In the front, they're always stunting. And the Giants don't, at least in the first game, and again, they might be like, oh, that was really successful, let's stunt more, right? But at least based on what we saw week 1, they didn't stunt a lot. And so when you know kind of your landmarks and your targets, it's a little bit easier to overtake. And I will say this about Dexter Lawrence, the way he's playing the nose, Vita Vea is a little bit more aggressive up the field, just a little bit. Dexter plays it pretty square, he's like a true read player almost. And I think that, and it's surprising he's so effective as a pass rusher, because you'd be like, that shouldn't work. But because of that, he's not firing off the line of scrimmage. So usually that lets the center, especially a quick kind of not undersized center, but a quicker center like Biotish, get the snap off and get into him before he can really get going. So there's times even though again Dexter Lawrence is one of the better defensive players in the NFL, where guys can sink double teams on him really well. They're not creating this great vertical movement, but they can sink the double team and at least get him off the spot in a way that you're not going to see with Vita Vea, because Vita Vea is going to stunt from the nose to the opposite A. He's going to stunt from the shade to the B. And he just, because of that movement, it makes it harder to really sink those doubles. So I think this matchup generally favors, but that type of stuff, those little details, also favor the Commanders as opposed to week 1, which was pretty tough.
Obviously, the weakest point, relatively speaking, of the Giants' defense is on the back end. How does Cliff take advantage of that, and what specific matchups do you like for Washington if they can get the protection and all the stuff up front? Right.
Yeah, well, I think the thing when you look at the depth chart for the Giants, and when you watch him play, I think Banks is a good player, good athlete, good physicality, but he's young. Nabin from Minnesota, the guy they drafted from Minnesota, rookie. He's a rookie starting safety. Yeah. No, Nubin. Yeah, thank you. So in the other corner starts with an F, Flott, something like that. Yeah. He also a young player. So they have, again, some of the same issues the Commanders have. They have in the back end. So what I would do is I would be like, how do we test your rules? How do we make sure you're lining up correctly to a bunch, to a motion? What's happening there? And I think when you watch the Minnesota game, you were talking about how how effectively that game was called by Minnesota's staff. A lot of it is they're shifting, they're motioning, they're getting good matchups, they're hitting stuff on the move. And I think there's an element of that. So, I've talked about how Cliff in training camp had more motions, had more shifts. I think this would be a decent game. I'm not saying go shift motion crazy. It needs to be every play. But, in critical down and distance, let's see if you're paying attention. Let's see if you were paying attention in the install on Monday, or on Wednesday if you're the Giants secondary guys. And again, they have not played a lot of football together. So how do they communicate certain things? Test those rules the way that Tampa Bay tested us week 1. So I agree. I think they've got some good athletes in the back end. I think the nickel player is a good player. The kid from Kentucky, they've got
Andrew Phillips.
They've got some good football players back there, but they're young. So let's make them work for it a little bit and see what they know and test their communication skills a little bit.
Yeah, it's interesting too. You talk about them not playing a lot of football together. I was just clicking through a couple of plays in NFL Pro, and they have who's on the field for each one, and like they even mixed up their corners last week. Like you got some Adoree Jackson, you got some Deontay Banks, you got some Cordell Flott, you got some Tyler Nubin, you got some Andrew Phillips. So like they had a bunch of guys go in and out of the game last week. So you talk about those reps together. There's only so much that they've stacked those through week one in a new defense, and can they take advantage? I was gonna say let's go a little bit deeper to wrap up here on some of the motion and that kind of stuff, because that's that becomes one of the big things. Like, Terry lined up on the left 87% of the time. They only use motion so much. I do wonder sometimes when some of that stuff is auto-populated, only because I felt like Cliff actually used a decent amount of motion, not like a ton, and it's not as intentional as like McDaniels, right? Like there's some of those like jet motions and those short motions right before the snap. Cliff's is more of like, hey, we're going to line up here. All right, jog across motion. Let's see if we can get a man zone read. Like it's a lot of information gathering. But I sorted NFL Pro. There's at least one mistake in your sorting mechanism, because it was like only 9 plays with motion. And then I was like, okay, let me go to the plays that don't have motion. And the first one I watched had motion. So I don't know what the actual percentages was, but I feel like there was a little bit more than maybe some of the numbers would suggest, based off of the fact that if it's being calculated off what I just described, then they missed at least one. But point being, Logan, that it was week one. There is more in the bag. We have seen some like full formation shifts. We have seen some jet motions, and we didn't see any end arounds or jet sweeps last week either. That's certainly in based off what we saw in training camp as a possibility. So how, like, I guess the fan version of this question would be like, does Cliff need to do some of that stuff that guys like McDaniel and Shanahan and O'Connell are doing, or is he able to accomplish it through other methods, like some of the similar stuff that is more in line with how Cliff's like the identity of who Cliff is as an OC?
Yeah, so I think if you're calling or designing a play, you got to ask why you would motion. Don't just motion to motion. Like I think, when Scott Turner was here, like I think they were like the 3rd team in terms of motion usage in the NFL, the Commanders. It was something like insanely high. Maybe it was like top 10. And everyone's like, oh, that means it's a healthy offense. That's a sign of a good offense. But there wasn't that intentionality you were talking about, like with the motion. It was like, oh, we're going to bring this guy back. And it's like, why are we doing it? Like, what's the point? So I don't want to motion to motion, because motion does create convoluted looks, or it can create a lot of convoluted looks in the secondary. When it's a static picture, I know where everybody's at. So I think that's the thing. It's like, we talked about it last year with Sam Howell and Eric Bieniemy. It's like, maybe Sam doesn't want a motion. Maybe he has a hard time seeing it. And so if you're doing, like, why are you doing it? What's the motivation behind the motion? I think that's always what fans have to ask themselves. If it's just like when you watch Mike McDaniels, every motion is doing something, right? I'm going to motion out. You got to expand with me because you're backing up. That little out underneath is always there for you, right? Like whatever it is. I think you can do stuff formationally that'll give you similar results to motion. I personally think motion is very effective. Again, my background is in this like West Coast Kyle Shanahan. We're going to move around, test you guys all the time, but you can do stuff formationally from a personnel standpoint to test them too, right? So for example, if we put a running back, a receiver, and a tight end in a bunch, who is in the bunch now? Who's in the coverage? If we're playing man coverage, I probably have a linebacker, a safety, and a corner. But if we cross release, then we cannot just play straight man on that, because we're going to get picks. So like now I've got a running back on a corner, I've got a receiver on a linebacker, and a tight end on a safety again, or however that works out. And that's an advantage for us offensively. So I think there needs to be enough variety, like tight bunches, full splits, motions and shifts, to keep the defense unsettled. Like what you don't want is a settled defense. And there are multiple different ways to do that. Like even getting in 4-by-1, like Cliff did a couple times in the game, like that is not a conventional look. And you're going to have a lot of communication about where we need to go to like make sure we're matching that effectively, right? And not leaving this poor corner on the backside one-on-one. So I think there's a couple different things. Again, I think a little bit more motions probably in the future, maybe not this week, but definitely I'd say in the next 4 or 5 weeks, you'll see more motion from Cliff as Jaden Daniels gets more comfortable, as he gets a better feel for the defense. Because that's the other thing, is sometimes early in the season, you don't know what the defense's answer is, versus motion. And you don't want to get them out of a good look because you're trying to motion. If that makes sense, right? Let's say
you line up, you get what you want, and now we've motioned and ruined it.
Yeah, or like we're motioning to the look we want, right? But they don't play it the same way, or it confuses the defender so bad that he's in the throwing window. You don't want that sometimes, right? Like it's not always advantageous. So I think as Cliff gets more comfortable with the responses to motion, as he gets more comfortable with what Jaden knows, I think that'll increase. But I think in the meantime, you'll see stuff like personnel-wise, bunch full width stuff, overloads pre-snap that'll be probably a staple. And then as they get more comfortable, motion will probably sprinkle a little bit more.
All right, that is our preview show for this week. Again, our next show will be from Northwest Field on Sunday night. I'll get it right eventually. Actually, I haven't really messed it up that much. It'll be from Northwest Field on Sunday night. That's the point.
I mess it up every day.
Well, now that I have to talk about it a little bit more because they're actually at home this week, there's probably a good chance that wasn't the last time that I messed it up. But yeah, we'll be there on Sunday. Logan, of course, will be on the sidelines for the radio broadcast. I'll be up in the press box, and then we will convene after I hit the post-game locker room for our post-game show. That'll be live on YouTube at the Team 980 at 106.7 The Fan and on my page at Craig Hoffman. And then it'll be in your podcast feed immediately after. We're not waiting for Monday morning anymore. So as long as you're subscribed to one of those places, you will get it as soon as we are done. And then we're back at it next week. Tuesday film, Thursday preview. Although, Logan, we have to wait a little bit extra for the game next week as week 3 is Monday Night Football in Cincinnati. Yeah. So we'll see what we do with that. But the podcast schedule won't change. But just waiting. Sunday we'll just sit around and watch football all day. That'll be fun. Nice, relaxing. Nice relaxing day of watching nothing but ball. And until then, everybody have a great weekend. Enjoy the game. Enjoy your anticipation, waiting for the game. And thanks for watching and listening to Take Command.
Thanks for watching this clip of Take Command, which has a brand new home.
That's right. You can watch on YouTube at the Team 980.
You can also listen to full episodes in the free Odyssey app, which is now enabled with Apple CarPlay. So we'll just, follow you around.